This is the new 400mm f/4.5 lens from Nikon for the Z mount. It's an S-line lens. It is absolutely razor sharp and it works really, really well with my Nikon Z9, even with teleconverters. And for me, I think it might be about to replace these two f-mount lenses, and that would be the end of f-mount for me after 18 years. Okay, so I've got the new Nikon 400mm f/4.5 S lens here, and the first amazing thing about it is that I've already got it. This lens was announced on the 29th of July, and I had it by the 17th of June. That's the wrong way around. Start that again. This was announced on the 29th of June, and I actually think part of the reason I managed to get one so quickly was that I was out and about in Finland, so I was 2 hours earlier than the UK in terms of time zones, because I had this by the 17th of July, which was bonkers really. But yeah, here it is. The first impressions are it's a very, very nice compact lens. It sits really nicely on the Z9. It feels really nice in the hand. Yeah, it's a very similar sort of size and form factor to the 500mm PF lens that I'm going to talk about a bit more in a minute. It's a touch lighter than that lens, especially when you consider that to use the 500 on my Z9 I would need an FTZ adapter in between for the mount. It's actually really, really light. It's lighter than my 70-200 Z lens, which is crazy really. If I do end up sticking with this as my main and a big telephoto, it won't be my heaviest lens. This will, which is weird. The construction seems really, really nice. It's got function buttons where you'd expect them on a lens at this level. It's especially good that it's got this sort of one on here for the memory set, because I really like that function. And then you've got 4 around the edge here and 1 here. I really like the lens hood. Yeah, sure, it's one of these that's got a button to release it, so it's not kind of nice big carbon fibre one like the really big primes, but it's got this rubber bumper on the end, which I think is perfect, because a large part of having a lens hood for me is protection of the lens for scuffs and bumps out and about. So yeah, that's really good. It's the same filter thread size as the 500 PF, so if you wanted to have a filter on it, you can. There is one issue with this lens being so light and compact, and that is that the point of balance for this lens with the Z9 is actually behind the lens foot, and so I have to have this silly plate sticking backwards off of here. It's quite uncomfortable to hold at the moment. It's actually not a problem that's unique to this lens. I have the same problem with my 500 PF, and I have the same problem with my 70-200. But for this lens, there is a solution in progress, and that is that I got in contact with Christoph Hayner at Hayner Photo, and he runs a shop that sells, among other things, custom-made replacement feet for lots of different lenses with that are Arca compatible. And he is in the process of making me a prototype foot for this lens that sticks back nearly to the bottom grip of the Z9, and that means I'll be able to balance this lens on the tripod, even with a teleconverter involved back here. But yeah, anyway, I'm looking forward to that, because that will really solve a problem. And if it works well, I shall be asking him to make me one for the 70-200 as well. So Why did I buy this lens? I live in Scotland and my wildlife photography is usually kind of opportunistic, walking around looking for things to photograph. In order to do that, I need something that I can carry around, and in Scotland it's not a place that's bright and sunny all the time, and the sort of wildlife that I would like to photograph is often most active during the early morning and in the evening when it's getting dark. So there are reasons that I would want something I can carry around and something that's very fast in terms of aperture. My go-to wildlife photography lens is currently this. It is the Nikon 500mm f/5.6 PF lens. And it has been absolutely fantastic from day one. I got this about 3 years ago and it's been an absolute game changer for my sort of opportunistic wildlife photography. It is absolutely phenomenal bit of kit. However, it has a couple of disadvantages. First one is obvious, it is a 5.6. So that means it is a bit limited in some low light situations. It's an f-mount lens, which means that to use it on my Z cameras, and I've been fully mirrorless since 2018, and while that is absolutely fine and it's weather sealed, it does provide an additional point of potential failure and an extra bit of faff that you have to kind of remember where the FTZ adapter is when you change lenses, and kind of, you know, opportunities for things to go wrong. And finally, when I'm doing video, this lens does make a little bit of noise when the vibration reduction's going, and I find that I have to actually put the mic on a cord a little distance away from me in order to really eliminate that from the video. So I said that that was limited sometimes in low light. Until around a year ago, I had a 300mm f2.8, again an f-mount lens of course, and that too was absolutely brilliant. It was just on the edge of being too heavy to handhold, but I could handhold it and I could carry it about, and the image quality was brilliant, and the fact that it was a 2.8 meant that I could use it in really low light. And for example, when I went to the hides in Finland, I had this guy and the 300, and as it got really dark in the middle of the night, I was switching onto the 300 and using that as it was getting really dark, and it was really good. Then about a year ago, as I say, I got the opportunity to upgrade to this guy. And this is, let's pick it up, to this guy. This is a 400mm f2.8. It is the f2.8G VR lens, the version, so it's sort of 2 generations old now if you count the new Z 400mm 2.8 with the teleconverter inbuilt. For me, a 400mm 2.8 is literally just the pinnacle of what you can get in terms of a big prime for wildlife photography, because you can put a 1.4x teleconverter on here and you're at 560 f4. You can put a 2x teleconverter on here and you're at 800 f5.6, and both of those leave you a little bit of room to stop down a bit to get the sharpness up after, you know, the inevitable contrast loss of the teleconverter. So for me, the 400 2.8 is like the most kind of, you know, that's where it's at in terms of versatility, I think, for having a really good low light lens and the ability to kind of extend it with the teleconverters and get really good reach while still having a really fast aperture. But this lens is really heavy. It weighs 4.7 kilos. I actually contacted another YouTuber, a guy in Estonia called Ragnis Panemets, I hope I'm pronouncing his name even roughly right, because to ask him some questions about this lens, because he had at that time very recently also changed from having a 300 2.8 to having exactly this model of 400 2.8. He had some really great advice, and one of the things he said was this: You may think, as I did, that plus 1.7 kilograms more weight is not that big a difference. But it is. So be ready for that. And I'm sorry, but I wasn't ready for that. I have to admit it, I wasn't ready for it. And this is really a bit too heavy for what I do. It has been an uneasy relationship between me and this lens ever since, because it is too heavy to handhold. Yeah, I've tried a few things to try and get it more portable. Obviously, most of the time I've used it on the tripod, the big tripod legs. I've got the Gitzo Systematic with the fluid gimbal. And that's great, but then that's just so heavy as a whole combination that you can't really carry it anywhere. So I've tried having it on a monopod, and yeah, that did make it more portable, absolutely, but you can't do anything that involves both hands unless there's somewhere convenient you can lean the lens or put it down. So for example, vlogging with that setup, next to impossible. I did actually take it with me in my rucksack on a trip to Knapdale, which will become a video at some point because I've recorded all that footage and it's on the hard drive, but I just need to edit it. And I took this, my camping gear, my vlogging gear, the big tripod, and it was absolutely horrendous walking 3.5–4 kilometers with this thing on my back with all that kit. When I got back, I weighed the pack, and even then, after I'd eaten the food and drank the water, the pack was still over 30 kilos. I was like, that's just stupid. But the image quality was so good that it was very hard to really know what to think. Okay, so I realise this has been maybe a little bit off topic, but I really wanted to give some context as to exactly what it is I'm asking from this lens. I've got my lightweight 500mm that's not always quick enough for the light conditions that I have. And I've got my absolutely beastly 400 that's very fast, but the idea of carrying it anywhere makes me cry a little bit. And really, when I started seeing rumours on nikonrumors.com about this lens, at the time they were talking about a 400mm f4, possibly a PF lens, I just started to think that that could sit really nicely in the middle between these two, and I could sell them both and just have one big wildlife lens that isn't really that big. And there's lots of advantages to that, as long as it's good enough. So as soon as this, the rumours sort of crystallise into a pending announcement, and obviously yeah, it turns out that it's not a PF lens and it's f4.5, and yeah, I knew straight away that I was going to get one at the very least and test it. So have a bit of my tea, and we'll start talking about some of the comparative tests that I've done. I suggest if you don't have a coffee or other beverage already that you get one, because I don't think this is going to be a short video. So the first thing I wanted to do was some autofocus testing. So what I did is I set the camera and lenses up on a tripod, looking at a parked car out the window. It's quite far away. Not infinity focus for these lenses, but definitely on the long end. And in my experience, the slowest movement in an autofocus system is the closest focus out to a far target. That's what I always find takes the longest when the focus is racking about hunting. So that's what I tested. So I brought the focus back manually, and then I pressed the AF on button and I measured how long it took focus to be acquired. And because I don't have a little viewing window, the way I did that is I videoed the back screen of the Z9, and I counted from the first frame where I could see movement in the image from the focus changing to the first frame where the focus acquired box turned from red to green. And I'll put the results of doing that on the screen right now. So what you're looking at on the screen is the average of 3 tests in each case, And we can see that the 400mm f/4.5, the new lens, is the fastest to focus out of all the combinations tested, and it acquires focus in 0.38 seconds on average. The 500mm PF is no slouch at 0.44 seconds, but the new lens is still 15% faster to lock focus. If we put the 1.4x teleconverter on the Z lens, it hardly makes any difference at all to the autofocus speed. It's still just 0.4 seconds, still faster than the 500 PF. Put the 2x teleconverter on the 400 4.5, does start to slow it down a bit, and that combination locked focus in 0.68 seconds. So out of interest, and just to show how fast the Z9 can drive f-mount glass even with teleconverters, I also put the 1.4x teleconverter on the 400mm 2.8, and that still acquired focus in 0.48 seconds. So basically nearly as fast as the Z lenses. So something that it's been very difficult to test and measure in any kind of quantifiable way is how sticky the autofocus is, and how good it is at locking on to subjects and holding it, and how that it might be different between the different lenses and combinations. I'm using firmware 2.1 with the Z9, which is the latest one at the time of making this video, and it has led to some improvements in the autofocus stickiness of small subjects in the frame. It is definitely locking on and finding subjects really well with all three lenses, especially the two smaller ones, but that's more that I've used them more in the time since the firmware update. I would say it might just be doing a little better at subject acquisition and tracking with the new 400mm S-line lens compared to the 500 PF, but it's very, very marginal. Once the teleconverter, the 1.4x teleconverter, is on this lens, then I find that actually it's not locking on quite as snappily and holding on quite as well as the 500 PF would in the same situations, or roughly same situations. But given that the autofocus is something that relies on contrast, and a teleconverter inevitably reduces the contrast, even if it's only a tiny bit, it would be logical for me that there would be a small knock-on effect in the autofocus performance putting a teleconverter on here. But again, it's really, really marginal, and I've been absolutely stunned by how well this lens performs with the 1.4x teleconverter. Absolutely blown away by that. So let's talk about image quality and sharpness and do some really sort of heavy pixel peeping. To test the image quality and sharpness of the lenses, I set up a target with a map, since that has lots of nice fine detail on it, and I photographed it from about 10 meters away. For the Z mount, I have the 1.4x and 2x teleconverters, and for the F mount I have the FTZ and the equivalent F mount teleconverters, the Mark III versions of the 1.4x and the 2x. I set the lenses up on a tripod and used the Nikon Z9 with a wireless release to ensure that there was no camera shake going through to the lenses from me pressing the shutter button. So first I wanted to see which was actually sharper between the 500mm PF and the 400 4.5 and the 400 4.5 with the teleconverter. So for this test, I moved the camera in between tests to have the same field of view on the map in each image. Images were brought into Lightroom, but were not processed any further than that. They were just imported. So we're in Lightroom, and here are the first pair of images on the screen now. Looking here at 200%, we can see that the 400mm 4.5 on the left is very slightly sharper and more contrasty than the 500 PF on the right. At 100% zoom, this difference is almost impossible to see, but the new lens is slightly sharper. So now here's the 400mm f4.5 with the teleconverter on the left, so that's now a 560mm f6.3, and on the right we have the 500mm PF again, and now the 500mm has the edge and is slightly sharper and more contrasty. But again, these differences become very, very hard to see at 100% zoom, and under normal viewing conditions there is really hardly any difference between them. Certainly there's no difference that proper post-processing would not remove in an instant at the kind of crops that aren't daft. So I should say that realistically this is extreme pixel peeping. If you're having to go to 200% to see the differences, then in the real world they're pretty much the same, and they are razor sharp, both of these lenses, even with the teleconverter on the 400mm. I'm just doing this as a kind of absolute benchmark and to really kind of push the sort of limits. Next I wanted to see how the different lenses and converters compared for a given final image, as in the end result in terms of the cropped image should be the same, so the field of view should be the same, but I'm not moving the camera this time, I'm actually scaling the image. So the following have all been cropped to something that's roughly 200% and 100%, but obviously because there's some scaling involved, they're not exactly those percentages. And yeah, apart from that, there's no other image processing being done on these. Looking at the new 400mm 4.5 on the left and the 500 PF on the right, at 100% we can see the upscaled 400mm image is a little bit softer, no surprise, and at 200% the 500mm PF is clearly better, and that's exactly what you'd expect given that the image from the 400mm had to be scaled up. So now we have the 400mm 4.5 on the left and the 400 2.8 on the right, and both are shot wide open, and the new 400mm 4.5 does have a very slight edge in terms of sharpness and of contrast. Of course, the big f-mount lens is 1 1/3 stops faster, and when we stop that down to f4.5, then they're basically the same, with perhaps a tiny bit more sharpness and contrast from the monster prime. So now let's compare the 400mm 4.5 on the left with itself, but with the 1.4x teleconverter on the right. We can already see that at 100% there is some loss of contrast with the teleconverter, but there is more detail in the 560mm image, as expected. That becomes even more clear at 200%, and of course in real terms that means that they'll end up sharper and punchier than the upscaled image would once proper post-processing has been applied to them. Having said that though, it is very impressive to see how much detail there still is in the upscaled image from the 400mm without the teleconverter. Now this is the comparison I was most interested in doing. On the left we have got the 400mm f4.5 with the 1.4x teleconverter, making it a 560mm lens with a maximum aperture of 6.3. And on the left we've got the 500mm PF f-mount lens. As before, the 500mm is still slightly sharper, even though the image has had to be upscaled slightly more to match the 560mm of the lens with the teleconverter. It's already noticeable at 100%, and at 200% it's very clear that the 500 PF does better in this test. This isn't really a big surprise, since the 500mm PF is spectacularly sharp, and even the Z teleconverters, which are probably the best that Nikon have ever made, still inevitably will reduce a little bit of contrast loss and a little bit of loss in image quality. And again, it's a really marginal difference still in terms of real-world usage of these images. So next I wanted to see how well the new 400mm compared to the big old prime, the big 400mm 2.8 with teleconverters. So here they both are with their 1.4x teleconverters. The new lens is on the left and the big monster prime is on the right. So shooting the lenses both wide open, the f-mount system is obviously at f4, and at 200% they are actually very similar, but maybe the new 400mm just has a slight edge in terms of sharpness with its converter. However, I can stop down the f-mount lens to a matching f6.3, and once I do that, it's clearly quite a bit better than the Z lens and teleconverter. So yeah, it really goes to show why the massive 400mm 2.8, even though it's an older lens, is still worth the same or more second hand than either of these two small primes new, because it really is that good. So switching to the 2x teleconverters, we now have 800mm on each one, and yeah, we've got the new lens on the left at f9 and the old lens on the right with the 2x teleconverter at f5.6, and it's very clear that the Z mount setup is sharper here with the lenses wide open. But then when the f mount lens is stopped down to f9 as well, it's very, very similar. And maybe there's a little bit more detail in the f mount image, but certainly the difference is far, far smaller than it was with the 1.4x teleconverters. And I think that's partly because the improvement in quality of the 2x teleconverter going to Z mount is absolutely massive, and so that's really shining here. So the next thing I wanted to do was test with a kind of real 3D subject. So I used this guy, a little toy crane. So I actually enlisted your help. I used the community tab here on YouTube, and I also used my Instagram account, and I took 5 images of this guy using different combinations of these lenses and teleconverters and settings. I brought those images into Lightroom and I post-processed them using my standard settings. I have a kind of a set of presets that I have put together that just kind of do the things I usually do to an image, and I did not do any sharpening or noise reduction, so I removed those options from Lightroom, and then I cropped them to all having, roughly speaking, the same field of view and scaled them appropriately, ready for uploading to YouTube and Instagram. And now it's time for the grand reveal, which one was which. So loads of folks said A was the sharpest, which is actually the 400mm 4.5 upscaled to the same size as the others. It really isn't the sharpest. Not by any means, but it really isn't that bad either. Next, B was the 400mm 4.5 with the 1.4x teleconverter. Not many of you thought that was the sharpest, and you'd be right, it wasn't. Then there was image C, and in fact image C was the f-mount 400mm 2.8 with the 1.4x teleconverter at f4. Some of you thought correctly, I think, that this was the least sharp, but it also had the nicest background rendering, which is what you would expect given that it has the widest aperture. Image D got the most votes for being sharpest, and I agree, it probably was the sharpest, and again it's the 400mm 2.8 with the teleconverter, but this time it is stopped down to 6.3 to match what the new lens can do with a 1.4x teleconverter. And the final image, E, was the f-mount 500mm PF. And that also didn't get that many votes for being sharpest, and in fact it got a similar number of votes to the 400mm 4.5 with the teleconverter. Now actually, looking on the computer, I would say that this image E is the second sharpest of the bunch, followed by image B, and then A and C are the least sharp. In hindsight, I should probably have only given you images B and E, because that's actually the ones I wanted to be able to tell the difference between. And I do wonder if the order in which the images are presented makes a difference to the outcome. I probably should have put them in different orders on the 2 platforms that I asked you on, because I don't really understand why A got more votes, because it's not really that sharp. Anyway, the take home from this was actually that the big 400 with the teleconverter stopped down a bit was still the sharpest of all, and also shows that the 400mm f4.5 is sharp enough that even upscaled, manipulated, dropped onto Instagram, it still looks really, really sharp. So, you know, that's pretty impressive really. And also the fact that the images are so similar at 150, 200% zoom, that really there's not a lot of difference, and it comes back down to the fact, as I said, this is extreme pixel peeping. These are all very, very sharp lenses and combinations. So given the size and weight of this new 400mm, I'm definitely going to be shooting this handheld a lot. So I really wanted to know how well it does with its vibration reduction at really low shutter speeds. The way I did that is I took it out on an overcast morning. There's this lovely slate on the side of our shed that Jess painted this sort of flower pattern on a couple of years ago, and it's got lots of detail in it. It's quite contrasty, so it's a good target. And I stood about 5 meters away from that, and I shot it handheld at successively lower and lower and lower shutter speeds, taking, you know, a good 20-30 images each time, and trying to keep it as stable as I could, hand holding it. And then I brought all the images into Lightroom, and I just counted how many were acceptably sharp. Now I should just say that in something like this, the keeper rate will be very much down to the photographer, technique in hand holding, how much coffee they've had, as I said, the situation of what's going on around them, and also what they consider to be acceptably sharp. So, you know, your mileage will vary, but I'll put the results as I have them on the screen now in a little bar chart. Let's talk through it. Looking at the 400mm 4.5 first, there's absolutely no problem shooting this at 100th of a second, and a very reasonable keeper rate to a 50th and 1/25th. And below that it becomes a bit more hit and miss, but I was able to get a couple of acceptably sharp images down to a 1/5 of a second, which I thought was pretty impressive. Adding the 1.4x teleconverter to the 400mm gives basically the same keeper rate down to a 50th of a second, but then it drops off to around half at 1/25th, and I really struggled to get anything acceptably sharp at lower than 1/25th of a second using the teleconverter and hand holding. With the 500mm PF, the results are basically the same as the 400mm, with the new 400mm maybe just being slightly better at lower shutter speeds, and that tiny difference might be because the new lens can take an advantage of what's called synchro VR, where the VR in the lens and the VR of the body work together to give an extra stop of reduction, and I think it's rated for 5.5 stops overall. But yeah, the 500 PF actually did very, very well here. And as for this guy, I didn't try hand holding it at 100th or a 50th of a second, because I already know the answer is that I can't. Sort of 500th of a second, 1000th of a second, I can, but the keeper rate's low. So it's time for my final thoughts and conclusions, and addressing the 400mm 2.8 first. Compared to this new small lens is so much lighter and so much easier to use that it's just no question that despite being a stop and a bit slower, this is just going to be a much better proposition for the kind of photography that I actually do than this guy. I really wanted to make this work for me, but realistically it's not, and so it's goodbye to the 400mm f2.8 G VR. Comparing to the 500mm f5.6, the new lens is slightly sharper, it focuses slightly quicker, but these differences are marginal. These are both absolutely phenomenal lenses. The only thing that swings me personally slightly towards this new lens is the fact that I would be switching to be entirely Z mount if I sold the 500 PF and kept this, and that would have the advantage of, you know, having only one set of teleconverters, no FTZ, and having the quieter lens in terms of vibration reduction, noise in video. And yeah, it's a really tough call actually. If you already have this and you are satisfied with what you're getting and you're happy to use the F-mount teleconverters and FTZ adapter, then there's no need to get this. If you want those marginal advantages, and if you want 2/3 of a stop more light in low light situations, then go for it. Once you stick the 1.4x teleconverter on here, you get a 560mm f6.3. So that is 1/3 of a stop slower than the 500 PF. The autofocus is still a little bit quicker though, and the sharpness isn't quite as good, but it's close. As I said earlier, I have the feeling, but I have no concrete evidence for this, that the autofocus stickiness isn't quite as hot as with the 500 PF when there's the teleconverter on here, but it is absolutely marginal. I mentioned lens noise and moving the microphone away from the camera and not having to do that with this lens potentially, but thinking about it some more, at least if I'm sitting with the lens on a tripod, I'm probably still going to put the microphone a little distance away, because the other thing that it eliminates is the rustles and movements of me moving around and moving the camera, and those things aren't going to change with a different lens. So maybe I need to keep doing that anyway. But oh, my light just went out. Right, where was I? My Lume Cube just ran out of juice, so I've had to plug it in, which I probably should have done to begin with. Never mind. What was I talking about? This is why we have notes. Yes, lens noise. Yes, I'll probably continue to put the microphone a little bit further away. So vibration reduction. I get the impression from those tests and also from using it that this lens does have a little bit of an edge in the vibration reduction over the 500 PF. That edge goes away, and indeed the 500 PF is better compared to this with the teleconverter at low shutter speeds. And of course the bottom line is really that these sort of 1/5 of a second, 1/10 of a second shutter speed images are all well and good, but it's quite rare that you have a wildlife subject that's going to be that still and obliging anyway. Throughout all of this, I keep being very impressed by how well the older 400mm 2.8 was doing in terms of image quality. I mean, yeah, I've moaned about the weight of the thing and how hard it is to use in the field, but the image quality is absolutely stellar. In terms of, you know, an absolute ideal for me, if money was no object, I would have something like this for a walk around wildlife lens, and I would have the new 400mm f2.8 S-line lens with the inbuilt 1.4x teleconverter. It's lighter, it's 2.9 kilos, so the same as my old 300mm, which I kind of could handhold. And the idea of having a 1.4x teleconverter that you could just switch in and out regardless of the conditions, you wouldn't have to kind of like worry about dust and shite getting in. That would be an absolute dream, it really would. But you know, there's no second-hand market for that lens at the moment. The price is stratospheric, and I simply can't afford, can't justify having something like that. But in a few years, when they start to appear second-hand, if I have saved wisely, then yeah, that is what I think I would aim for. I might get one of those. I would certainly like to have a 400 2.8. In terms of the image quality, I have really, really enjoyed having one, but I just have to accept that in practical terms, I can't really use it in what I do. It's too heavy. And yeah, I feel a little bit silly saying this, but it matters to me that my big wildlife lens for these f-mount lenses has had a gold ring on the end of it. This doesn't have a gold ring. It sort of has a silver ring here next to the control ring. But am I daft? I really, there's some kind of, having lusted after these big primes ever since I was a teenager getting into photography, that you know, that kind of kudos of having the gold ring around the end of your massive lens, so it does actually mean more to me than it probably should. So yeah, one day perhaps the gold ring will return. But yeah, for now, I feel it's safe to say that this lens is good enough to replace my two f-mount lenses, and that is the way I'm going to be going. At the outset of these tests, it really only had to be as good as the 500 PF in the usual sort of walk around wildlife scenarios that I would do, and I'm happy to say that it's good enough for me. And yes, as I said before, if it was only a question of this versus this, the 500 PF versus the new 400, then it would be a very, very hard call indeed. But as I also want that slightly lower light capability that comes with the 4.5, and the fact that it's a little bit zoomed out compared to 500mm, I think 400mm is a bit of a sweet spot for what I do. So yes, this is going to be the end of my F-mount journey after 18 years. So as usual with any of these test videos, the disclaimer I have to give is that your mileage may vary, your kit may be different, your opinions on what is acceptable sharpness or autofocus stickiness will definitely be different, and yeah, some of the techniques involve technique, and frankly most people's technique is probably better than mine. So, you know, have to put this disclaimer in. These are my results with my kit, with the tests I've done, and I will simply tried to present them to you as best I can, but you'll have to kind of take from them what you will. And really, if you need to know how well these things work with your kit, you have to do the test yourself. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting to you, or even useful if you are looking to buy any of these different lenses yourself. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment, like the video, share it with your pals. All of those things definitely help the channel. I know this has been incredibly gear heavy as a video. There will be more wildlife photography ones coming soon, I promise. I've got lots that I need to edit. I also have a few other gear review ones that I need to do as well, because I've promised companies that I'll review stuff. There will be videos coming where I'll be using this combination and the teleconverters to do actual wildlife photography. So if you're new here and you want to see those, please make sure you subscribe so that you get to see those. And yeah, thanks very much for watching. I'll finish the video here with some images and video footage that I've taken with the Z9 and the new lens over the past couple of weeks. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.